Hi, we are Tim and Carolina, and we are a couple of friends, colleagues, and former coworkers. We love the content and building products industry, and for the past many years, we've been friends, bouncing ideas off each other, talking perspectives, residential, commercial, sales, technical, market research, data analysis, much more, including one of our favorite topics, which is a big segment, which is content or construction technology.
And that, among many other things, have inspired us to share our experience and our guests' experiences to broaden perspectives in the construction verse. And it's all made possible by you guys, our listener, and support from Advancing Prefabrication coming up in February in Dallas, and Project Fluent Construction Language Fluency. All right.
Today,
Well,
we're Tim and Carolina. A lot of times it's just us talking, but today we
Yeah.
have someone with a very unique perspective, someone who came from the software and tech world, decided the built environment needed some serious user experience design thinking, different perspectives. There's the whole name of the podcast. And Rami Ayaso is here with us, and he bridges two worlds that don't really get to talk to each other that much, or and nearly as much as they should. Digital logic and physical reality. So, Rami, welcome to Build Perspective Podcast. Thanks for jumping on with us.
yeah, absolutely. A pleasure.
All right, so we're going to dig right in because,
Let's get after it.
yeah. So tell us the moment that you realized, we haven't told anybody what you do yet, but the moment that you realized that traditional go to market or digital ops for building products needed a little tweaking, maybe was fundamentally broken.
Yeah. And I think it's worth sharing that more from like what experiences did I go through that kind of revealed that. And so my journey into AEC over the 5 years coming from software was more experimental in some ways. And it was very research driven. In fact, that was one of the big things for me learning software was that what am I even building here? Like you can know all the code you want, but then it's like, what are you even doing? And so the research part always found it interesting. And well, research in many ways is really observing behaviors, learning from people and how they interact and what's like top of mind. And so for the first few years, I was literally just talking to all sorts of different professions, so different trades or different, let's say, roles in firms, whether they be a GC or architecture firm, things like that. And throughout that, I was like kind of like getting insight into sort of like, well, where are those friction points? And over time, I kept realizing that, construction materials as a topic kept kind of surfacing in such different angles that the moment I started looking at, okay, where are the touch points where a material selection maybe happens in early stages of a project that can then lead to further decision making. And I noticed that a lot of the, let's say, exchanges that happened there were so disconnected from like the digital workflows that different firms maybe have, or how their team structure is, and how like different teams have different functions and what gets outsourced to, consultants or what stays within. And so I always thought that dynamic was very interesting in terms of like how the touch points aren't always connected, but in some ways they are. So it's probably important to realize that it's not like everything's broken. Some things are working, right? But in many ways, it's like as we evolve, maybe the design workflow and stakeholder interactions are kind of facilitated in different ways. That's where I start realizing that, okay, either the team really knows what they're doing or they might need guidance, and then the tool maybe sometimes just adds more friction than it solves for problems. And
Yes.
so there's all of that, but primarily it kind of just came from this observation that the dynamics are so different. There is no one solution fits all. And so that whole dynamic alone kind of sets this, yeah, kind of interesting like playground of what is going on here kind of thing. Yeah.
I like that you mentioned, or you said, not everything is broken, some things are working. Um, because I feel like the industry, especially ever since that McKinsey report came out, I don't remember, it's been probably 10 years now. It got a lot of airtime talking about how broken the construction industry was. Nothing good was happening. Productivity is terrible compared to other industries, and there's no innovation, and everyone's building the same way they were 100 years ago. And so, in some cases, that's a fair assessment. But there's still a lot of really great things happening. So when you say Yeah, everything is broken. What was working that's like a good, foundation to build on? Uh, I know we're going
Um,
to talk about what's not working too, but
Yeah, I mean, it's probably also important to put into position that there might be some angles I have yet not been too in tune with or explored or been even in the middle of the practice or like the operation that I might be neglecting. So just to kind of like level set even my position and experience, it's like there might be things I'm still learning. But primarily the fact that a project takes time, and I think that the creative process of a project and how it iterates, that whole cycle kind of has its own place in sort of where the interactions happen or who is involved with what. And I think that was also something that I found interesting was how much the incentive structure really mattered. Like knowing, the formalities of the project, like what is the contract structured like, and who's really involved in what, and where do the stakeholders really have a say into things. And I think that always sets a precedent to sort of like how's this project likely to go. And I think that that's where like there are interesting nuances there. But in ways that things are working is that you just have people with experience who know what to look for right away, right? So there isn't like there is no gap in terms of like we still want to figure out something when we know that this is something we need to look at now than later. So like I think the experience that people bring to the table is always going to make some things always work because they know where to look at and what to target as a topic. But I think where things get interesting is when you're exploring new materials or new systems. And I think that's where the conversation ends up being more interesting in the sense that you want to learn more than putting in what you think works. And I think that's where the line starts to kind of separate a bit in terms of like, this is what we've done before and we know this works
right,
versus, well, this is just a new system. So we might need to learn what this does and how it influences maybe other decisions. And so
Yeah,
that's probably where, yeah,
I think that innovation is really about preserving what works. It's not about just evolving and innovating for the sake of innovation. Innovation is smart innovation, intelligent innovation is based on preserving the stuff that's worked and then improving on it in an
yeah,
informed way, like you're saying, like doing your research, talking to the people that know, and then also exploring ways that problems can be solved in a more resilient and expedient way.
sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point, and I think it comes down to like, to some extent, the culture of how exploration happens, and I think that's probably where things could start take an interesting direction. Where, in some ways, it's about like to what degree can one be open about their ideas without feeling like they might be expressing an opinion that puts them in a different view compared to everyone else on the project. Like, so to what extent is that courage allowed, I guess, and to some degree, without any repercussions, right? Like you don't want there to be consequences to voicing an opinion, but obviously it has to be logic to the project. But it just comes down to kind of how do you advance that alternative view and kind of bring it to the table in a way that's practical to consider, for sure.
well, for everybody involved, because each person's practicalities, motivations, and incentives are different. Like we have multiple stakeholders involved in a project, and they all have something to win and lose out of it, something different. And a lot of times it's a
Absolutely.
zero
And
sum
so
zero
to
sum
that
game.
end, what are ways that materials can be discovered now? Like new products coming into the market, whether that's an actual building product that's being manufactured or some sort of software or, climate tech, contech, you know, what
Yeah.
what what are you seeing out there?
Well, so my journey that got me very focused on the building product side actually came from, so kind of, let's say 2, 3 years ago, it was more like 2 years ago. I started noticing just being in the startup world, I tried to like immerse myself and kind of see like how do investors even make decisions around, what a startup means in terms of like, success and how it tackles things. And I was just attending them to kind of learn and observe how, the interactions happen. And I kept seeing a pattern where more hard tech startups were pitching and they were focused on building products. And I was a bit surprised. I'm like, where is this coming from? Like suddenly the whole world converges back to buildings, and I'm like
Mm,
thinking it's so distant. But it came from the realization that they were just innovating on the material chemistry. It was really the thing. And then kind of like realizing that, okay, thermal performance matters. And where does that matter most? Well, in buildings, it can matter quite a bit. And so, but in those interactions, start realizing, okay, more and more building products are coming in. And the design of these products was also what was interesting. Sometimes they were going, because they are from the industry, they know how this can improve like an installation time, for example, for something of a similar equivalent. Or it would just be something that um, they would like design the product to be like a direct substitute to something that is already common and people procure so that it can like target the whole or alleviate the steep learning curve of a new product, for example. But in that dynamic with building product, the discovery aspect, I think is changing. I'm not going to say very quickly, but enough to where we're realizing that there are more ways in which we can learn about new products based on what we're actually looking for. I'm not going to name any particular tool, but there are quite a few that are kind of shifting the business model of even how consultants are in the loop. For example, as you're looking at a maybe a glazing, like you're looking for specific windows with certain maybe operable, non-operable kind of aspects. So not to get the very specific like specification kind of requirements, but it kind of gets interesting then to kind of say, okay, what does this project actually need and what might be in the market today that could fit this project's need? And I think that's what's interesting that I think is kind of happening today is how much can the project direct what materials it needs rather than the other way around. And I think that's kind of interesting there for how it can be more of a project calls for this because it's located here and this is what might be available in a work best, or things like that.
I
It,
think
it
I've
could be a
heard
much,
architects talk about that, especially architects and designers saying let the project tell us what it wants. So you have the different parts of it. You have the budget, you have the owner, you have all these different things going on. But
yeah,
have it dictate at least part of the story so we know where to start, you know.
yeah.
But I love this line on your website. It's the headline on your website, which is a cool font, by the way. It says
Which is
innovating
being used by
engineering.
many. Did not make
Yeah.
up the font. It's amazing. Yep.
It says innovating and engineering building products is hard. Commercialization doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
That ties into because you're a go-to-market guy. Caroline and I were talking about that before you joined the call. The what when someone asks you like, what do you mean by that? How do you explain that? Of course, commercialization is different for different products, right? Different sectors. It's again, you have to let the product and the sector tell you, how it goes, because I feel like that's changing. The way products are commercialized. I'll give you an example as
Yeah.
a sort of a starter to the question, and that is uh, the two-step distribution model, which was typically how building materials went to market for 100 years. But you see less and less of that. You see more of this direct relationship with the end users and the contractors and so forth. So the software world doesn't have brokers like that typically, but the hardware world does because hardware is hard. And how are you seeing that change in relation to your headline? I know that was a long rambling question, but
Well, even to me, in terms of understanding what commercialization means for a building product, it's very, I think anyone can agree that there is no, one size fits all kind of strategy, right? So it's definitely going to be a strategy with multiple channels. And here I might start using like more like sales terminologies because they kind of fit within the context. But it really comes down to understanding like what are the channels that actually make most sense for one year category and who you're actually going after. And one thing I noticed, since I deal more with the early stage side too, so that's probably another area to kind of emphasize that I find that the early stage building product segment it has a different kind of approach and outlook on the market than established players, especially in terms of like how they know their procurement cycles happen and things like that, and what's already established. But for the early stage, especially, they're much more there's this desire to really understand who their market is and understand how to get to them in all the various ways they can. And so without, you know, the digital side of things can be very confusing for how ad spend can ramp up and maybe in the right segments, maybe in not. There's so many ways you can filter for things. But what I found, especially in my early years, I was working within BIM. I had this like kind of funny thought, funny now. Back then, I was like so serious about it, but it was like I thought BIM would change orders. Like BIM would just like reduce change orders and make them like not a thing.
We
And
all
like
did.
I'm pretty sure many people thought BIM was a solution for everything. Guess what? It was like, yeah. And so, but in that sense, when I was looking at it from that standpoint, I realized that the BIM libraries and all these representation of the building products, especially at higher LODs, so we're looking at like actually putting in all the connections and things like that, that things could get really tricky there if you were dealing with a manufacturer that maybe didn't look into that as much. And so it added more friction points to, say, a design team to actually model a manufacturer's object so they can go in the model and represent the project as it had to. Um, the BIM execution plans that I've learned are norm in projects can be pretty critical in terms of like what you actually need to deliver. And so like there's also this like liability concern to some degree on how you can put a manufacturer's product into a model. That's like a whole different story. But in the context of a manufacturer being, let's say, up to speed on how they go to market and the channels that they apply to, that was the main angle that I came into through was that the BIM libraries and how the products were modeled, not all manufacturers were on the same page about delivering that. Now, manufacturers understand that, have always made sure they had all their DWGs and PDFs, all the spec sheets, and the BIM models and libraries. But that wasn't the case for all of them. And that's what that kind of gave me an itch to my head. Like, wait, why is this not treated with the same priority by everyone? And it can vary by building product category too, for sure. Um,
So tailing to that, how do you think Procore got such awesome adoption
well, I
as
think.
a for a GC?
Well, I think Procore at this point goes much further into the like construction phase of a project. In terms of and Procore, I think maybe I can't speak much of it because I only know so much about how Procore established an ecosystem for apps to exist within their project management kind of environment and to enable more exchanges between stakeholders. And in fact, I have seen that in more recent years, they've been pushing on the pre-construction side quite a bit so they can bring in and make these data and feedback loops a little bit more consistent. So, I mean, generally, I would say the trajectory is where it makes more sense because you want to bring in early decision making to project development a lot closer to each other. So, and I think that's the principle and goal that most are going after is to just kind of close any gaps that may exist in that feedback loop, and then kind of being where people are already. So, with Procore, that's a pretty specific example because that's already a product with so much adoption, right? So you already
Right, but
have like,
it's, you
yeah,
know, it's the hardest people to get to adopt your product would probably be a general contractor. And just Procore has done an amazing job. It's almost like saying AutoCAD now.
right. Well, I mean, it is a leading PM tool, right? As far as I
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
And the marketplace has been. I know a lot of startups that have their apps on their app store, right? So they can integrate efficiently. And integration in software that might be another topic, but integration in software can be tricky sometimes. You have to be very thoughtful about sort of like, yeah, how that product actually transmits the information and then how it loops back and then what your product offering does. In many ways, I find that content can be very cannibalistic in terms of how the tools enter the market because there can be so many feature overlaps. And sometimes there might be like this just one thing that this other tool has. And it's like, are you going to give up everything just to shift for that one feature? Or do you want to amplify it somehow? So I think that even for anyone developing tools and content, being aware that if it's a specific feature set that you know is not existent there, it might be about amplifying that without ruining the experience for everything else. And so that can be pretty interesting too, for sure.
That's a pretty big piece to touch on in terms of like the App Store. I mean, obviously that was a huge thing for the iPhone, huge thing for Salesforce when they added an App Store, Procore, obviously. And there's some we don't have that for hardware, right? Like for instance, one of the big challenges with mass timber is there's all these things happening not in silos. I kind of hate, I don't love that word, but there aren't a lot of other great words like it. But these things are happening, but there's the integration of them. There's a scope gap in terms of integrate. There's no app store for mass timber. There's no app store for like engineered wood products. Eventually, sort of got it because they had Simpson. Then they had the adhesives, and the hand tools, the different things that made it, sped the adoption once those things were. But we just don't have a lot of that for the hardware world that would maybe speed adoption of a product. But manufacturers probably, you probably have a thought on this, I'm guessing, because maybe manufacturers should be considering what is my app store, not from a software standpoint, but from a hard a product standpoint.
Possibly. I don't think many manufacturers spend too much time thinking about what software they want to adopt next, to be honest. And just in terms of like, but it's just that the day-to-day is too busy. Like there are just so many operations that are ongoing at any given point that depending on what workflows have already been established, the need for the tool might arise only in a context where you might start believing, could there be a better way to do this? And I'll be honest with you, one thing I found was pretty interesting. So when I kept meeting BIM engineers, and I met with them at a point when they were shifting their roles to another company or they were looking for another role. And I was kind of intrigued by like, what was their drive? Like they've been at this company with like 5, 7 years. Looks like they're doing great. What's their call? And in many ways, what I found is there are lots of people who know tech enough to build internal tools. They're never going to be like published or anywhere. They're just like for the firm because it is a very nuanced kind of workflow that they've seen brings them frustration. And so they're just like, I'm just going to whip something up here that was going to work for everyone. And, oftentimes that ends up being like the app store, if you will, in terms of like someone finally realized, or it's not even about finally, it's more like they got the drive and motivation to actually bring this to their team and make things work better. And I see that being a very common instance where it's like more like, okay, I know exactly the quirk that we're dealing with here, and this might just help us out. And so I think there's some mindfulness to that as well in terms of like, well, this is a very unique thing. You might not find it off the shelf, but can someone whip something up here and figure out what might work? And so that sometimes also is a practical angle I've seen work.
I wonder how many building product manufacturers and even the LBM, the supplier world, has those that they use internally that customers would find hugely useful, but they never get commercialized. They never get pushed out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people I've seen this in the prefab world, I'm sure you have too, where everybody has their own estimating software or their own way of working or their own specific processes. And then when you try to come in and bring them like the solution that you brought down from the mountain because you had the drive and the motivation because you had a problem that you solved for yourself and now you want to share it with other people, then you find out that, no, we've got our own way of doing it. We've got our own way of solving it. But going back to the ecosystem thing, I think for hardware, I like how you're calling that hardware, Tim. I like that a lot. So for building materials, even if you don't have a cache of products that you offer, there are always products that are used with your product. And, in the Project Fluent world, we call that brandscaping, which is, what are the products that you sell that are adjacent to yours that don't compete with yours? And then can you guys partner up and collaborate? And I see that very, very successfully out there. And I know
Hmm.
Tim and I have talked about that too. Just it's more, what do you call it? Co-opetition. It's more about, providing
Yeah.
the right solution to the customer. And when you do that, you have the great customer experience. People want to come back. So you have great customer retention and you get referrals and you just get more jobs and you amplify your reach in that way too.
Yeah. I think on that front, what's interesting, so when I was looking at projects where they knew that there was going to be repetition involved, now they weren't sure if, like, say, modular was going to be the solution. So they just kind of mock up all sorts of different assemblies and kind of figuring out the corners and all the junctions and things like that. I thought that was always an interesting kind of phase at which a project starts realizing what works with what. And I always found that to be kind of interesting the dynamic of product selection, because then you would kind of like realize, okay, is this something that, because the once the estimation workflow goes into place and everyone starts punching in the labor times and the equipment requirements and things like that, I think that's where interesting decisions can happen. But yeah, on the mocking up of products, I personally think is somewhat underrepresented in the sense of like how much better that can be, because it takes a lot of experimentation potentially to know that this might work with that, and like putting everything together in a fast way is very impractical today. So you'd have
Do you
to like
mean
spend a
like do you mean like digital twins technology or like that? Is that what you're
um
talking about?
No, I'm actually like about physical mock-ups where like
Oh,
the
okay.
testing of the products, yeah, are actually put together. Because like that was a conversation I was having with someone where they were kind of working on something with like bill of material kind of stuff. And the conversation that struck to me then, because they were telling me from their own experience, was like, for example, adhesion of products one to the other, and that you couldn't always just take whatever adhesive you think might work that worked on a previous project if you're not very sure about the materials you might be using in this other project. And so like it was like that very simple component of like not everything gets nail gun together, right? And
Mm,
so like it was kind of like that principle of, well, at this point in time, given that we have such a broad range of products that we put together, what is the true matching that we can do at scale to some degree? And I feel like that's not really being tapped into because it just takes so many projects to really figure out who's going to set the budget to just experiment products working together for no reason. But I don't know, maybe that's an idea for a new investment fund. I don't know. But yeah, but that's one thing I thought was always interesting is like the actual, because how much can we simulate it is the question. And I think to some degree, like I'm not sure how the testing, I know to some degree, the regulations call for testing a assembly together, depending on the municipality too. So I think there's that regulatory aspect too for like what the code requires that sets a whole different game leveling thing to what could be pursued for a given project.
mm.
Yeah, I love that that you brought the testing into it because that we did our NFPA 286 testing and NFPA 285 we redid recently. And the
Hmm.
amount, like it never ceases to amaze me the number of things just in a wall assembly. We're not talking, you know, MEP at all, anything, just a wall assembly, how many different vendors and inputs there are just to
Yeah.
do a mock-up to be able to test it. But that in its own case, an assembly is almost like a physical app store of, multiple things that have to coordinate and integrate to work together to achieve an outcome that meets this certain standard, aesthetic, all these different things it's got to do and got to
Yeah.
perform for. That's really
I've
Yeah.
interesting.
seen I've been seeing a lot of successful manufacturers out there. I've been talking to a lot of manufacturers recently, and the ones that have just they seem to have grown overnight, to both of your points, are ones that are partnering up with either suppliers, alternate vendors, or creating products that are very, very complementary to what they've been known for, what they offer, and that amplifies both of
Yeah.
their footprints. And I know that when I was at growing Ventec, we partnered up with insulation companies, with adhesives, with any other products, and we shared the testing costs because it benefits both companies.
Yep. Yeah. And that's actually a great way to actually offset that barrier that might be the cost of it, right? Because then it becomes
Mhm.
more collaborative thing. And yeah, that I think that's the approach that really leads to an interesting kind of adoption scale because it just gives one more flexibility to and how they tackle the market, generally speaking, for how do they know this is a unique product solution, for example, as a system or as a collection in that sense. Yeah.
So one thing I was reading about you is that you want to add the human element in autonomous environments. It's something that we can't really forget. And now that everybody's talking about AI and the future of sales and the future of whatever, the world, um,
Yeah.
it is very important to retain that human element. And it shouldn't be like a robot that has a human face, right? Like the human element is the human element. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think I might take a step back in terms of uh, sharing some alignment and sort of how I'm viewing the AI world as it's evolving now and where I believe we are in terms of like what that means. So, the last few years have definitely gone pretty fast in terms of the capabilities of what this artificial brain can do for us. And I think the human side as a topic, this might become more philosophical to some degree, but I think like any other tool, understanding its capabilities will shape us in a different way to really understanding if we look at it as something that one needs to give us an output, or is it a machine that's there to iterate our inputs for whatever output we're looking to do? So I'm also more systematic and just still looking at it as something that requires inputs to create some kind of output. And in that function, what is the output that we really want from these machines and systems that are now being developed to be very capable to what we might be able to have the cognition for. Um, and it's still very clear that there is a human spark thing that the AI can't replicate. And every AI leader today knows that. And so like it's very much that it's now the job of understanding what does that alignment look like when the human process and AI's capabilities are in conjunction to deliver something better. Because I mean, ideally, it kind of still drives back to like the organization culture in terms of what AI wants to do for them. Because the capabilities are to some degree, to what extent do you want them to be, and what touch points do you want to create? Like, for example, I'm thinking, saying some of these voice AI stuff. We're talking about sales, right? And so, like, for example, say you have, and this has been more in like some interactions I've had with some manufacturers I'm keeping in loop with where they'll get inquiries from architects to ask them about the product, right? And it might be a phone call, it might be an email. And that interaction can sometimes be very specific that, okay, I'm just like, it's an RFI basically kind of thing. Or it's more, this is an opportunity towards an RFQ. And that's going to like lead to some kind of touch point that could get your product adopted into a project. And I think in that sense, when we look at AI, it's more like, well, what does your team currently do that you know there may be missing gaps or things that could be improved on, where the AI could fit in to just ease up the human for where they might face friction in the things that they do with their whatever they might be using on their computer or even the touch point in itself. Um, and I think that's where things get interesting because to unlock that human element, I think we need to go back and kind of understand, well, what frustrates you today about why you need to look at your monitor for, because like I'm imagining that like the how much time we spend behind the screen versus actual experiences with the client or prospect is like a whole different conversation. And so I was also pretty intrigued by I met someone who they review manufacturers' sampling experience. And they look at sort of how they sample their products, how they ship them. But what I learned through that was some manufacturer that they worked with, they basically created this showroom where they create like physical interactions with their clients to potentially experience their product beforehand. And so I think there might be a thing where AI might just be like a side thing to the actual big picture that we need more experiences that maybe require physicality potentially, right? And like
Mhm.
things that actually get it. Because like we're talking about buildings, like they're real thing, So like how much do you want to stay behind the screen until you actually start feeling and engaging with something? And so I think that the human piece might still be more lean towards like, well, what kind of physical experiences could we enable that we couldn't before? And the AI could just maybe take on things that we humans wouldn't even like to do anyway, right? And so like, and I think that's where there might be an interesting kind of insight in terms of like, well, are there experiences we should be doing that we can enable us for now because we have more time to do it, or we offset the cost for needing a human to like click on these buttons that they never wanted to, click on. And so I think that might be kind of like looking at the physical side as well as the digital of like reducing boring human work that no one really wanted to do that the AI could now do.
That's really interesting. The tension in the marketplace. between the human element and then, uh, the uncertainty of what that all means with autonomy and AI into the future. Um, I like that we're talking a lot in this conversation about physical and non-physical things, because you make this statement and awesome document you created. Thank you for sending that in advance. That technology is rarely the answer. And a lot of times we just want to throw technology at it, throw some ones and zeros or something like that at it. But maybe that's fun to do from an engineering standpoint, and you get to like prototype new products and stuff like that really quickly. But what's behind that? It feels like there's something very deep behind that statement. Technology is rarely the answer.
Because more often than not, there's always a human function in the middle. And like over the years, and also like I'm still like a growing person too. So I'm like, as the kid grows up, we adults still grow up too. Like in some ways, right? We observe things and kind of make up stuff. And well, make up just in terms of like what we're seeing, like, the interactions being. And there's still the human interaction piece that really drives the reasoning behind why a problem occurs or why something needs to be looked into further. And it's not coming from a place of, oh, technology is to be dismissed because this is a human interaction. Not at all. It's kind of understanding how does this human interaction actually lead to areas where we know technology can address them, and how that actually takes any step further, depending on whatever the outcome is that we're trying to achieve. And so, in that standpoint, if you take a step back, you'll always realize, well, yeah, it was never the technology being the piece. It was more like we were trying to do this, and this is how we were trying to do it. And guess what? We ended up in this something, right? And so, and that's, I think, where it's hard to see on the ground and in the middle of it, because you're just so in the weeds of it all. So then you start losing track of sort of, what is technology the solution? Is it not? What is it even doing? So I think there is a lot of that too, that goes into it. But it's really just coming from this kind of like rather objective viewpoint that our human interactions lead to new problems and new solutions. And they will continuously start creating opportunities where technology might be the answer or might not, because again, it's still driven by us and our interactions to achieve that certain thing. So yeah.
That is fascinating. That's like, to me, that's the heart of the conversation
Yeah.
today. Because yeah, that AI is a computer. And yeah, why not take away the computation requirements of our daily lives, our day-to-day work, and use what no one else can replicate, which is our humanity and our ability to relate, our ability to really uncover problems and really be of service to people, really actually make a difference, really actually move things ahead, and then use technology as the
It's an
support,
enabler.
the
It's an Yeah,
exactly an enabler. Thank you. That's
because
the
yep.
word.
Even with AI right now, like I've been using it pretty extensively, seeing also where its limitations are. It's actually the funniest thing to see with AI is when you start realizing that it has memory constraints. And I think that's like the biggest one everyone's been kind of like having a deal with, which is why Google kind of picked up quite a bit too, was that the context windows under which you can process things was the heart of how you can get the most out of AI without it giving some weird made up answer or something where like you didn't even ask it that and it did that. So yeah, from that standpoint, I think that's where it gets very interesting to kind of like we can memorize in certain ways and we connect the dots and synthesize in much different ways than AI can to some degree. But I think there's some huge potential when we put the two together, and AI's ability to synthesize with ours, and when we can give it like volume that we would never be able to process, that's like truly, yeah,
Perfect.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, one question that we really wanted to ask you is, but I think you've already answered it, but maybe not. In a world where products are copied all the time and copied quickly, where do you think real moats are being built in the industry now?
And we're talking about physical hardware products or just like in generally about the act of like copying and replicating. existing functionalities.
I mean, I think both. I think both, but more in the hardware, more in building products that are being manufactured. Stuff gets copied all the time. There's different kinds of fiber cement and trim and adhesives, and
Yeah.
so where is the moat?
Yeah, I think that's subjective to some degree, at least from like the
Sure.
product category. Um, I'm not too versed in understanding the defense layers, like say from like a legal standpoint or patents, because I do sometimes see where products like emphasize that this is a patented thing,
Yeah, don't
but
copy
like
that.
yeah, and but that doesn't stop replication from happening though. I mean, in that sense. And it's kind of crazy what I've sometimes dealt with people who still found it cheaper to manufacture things offshore and they end up in these environments. And that's like a whole different game of you just expose your product, right? And are you working with the right partners? So I feel like that becomes its own narrative. Um, I'm not sure how much I have to add to this in a sense that maybe adds value too, but I would just think that it comes down to, I think, access. Because, like, let's take any given product in this case, and if the need for it to be copied arises, that just means that that's a good product, right? Like, that just
Mm,
means that the market has a call for it and they see it being useful. And so I'm not sure at what scale one needs to get to start realizing, like, okay, is there a different distribution system, at least in terms of how, let's say, the inventors are rewarded for it to some degree too. Because I think it also comes down to like, well, what's the business model here? Because no one likes to be cheated on, right? No one likes to have like things taken away from them in that sense. And so like, does the market reach a consensus to where like, okay, we can agree that this design, so that you don't end up in like maybe nasty like legal action stuff, right? And behaviors that we don't like humans getting into, you know? And so I would imagine then at that standpoint, it just becomes an aspect of, well, the market sees this as a healthy solution or like a good solution for whatever case. And then it might become just a conversation of, well, how does that product get enabled into the market in a way that's maybe friendlier from a business standpoint, especially with respect to the innovators behind, because the act of copying, becomes a bit like disrespectful to some degree, but out of necessity too, to some degree as
mm,
well. Because like it might just be an access thing. Like imagine dealing with a manufacturer extends the lead time to the degree that it literally calls for someone, I'm just gonna do it myself, right? And like
mm,
if that was the scenario, at that point that just calls for the fact that, well, they're not growing maybe as much as they should, right? And then the market just adapted accordingly. And so I think there's like some dynamic there. But yeah, I think it's more of a signal than anything. It's just more of a signal that, okay, something here works or something here is timely for the situation. And if it got brought to market and start getting copied, then that just validates things.
mm.
So, you know,
Maybe it's just about protecting your reputation, and that's the moat. Maybe it's people are gonna you can't control what anybody's gonna do. They're gonna copy you, they're gonna go to the competition, they're gonna develop their own thing, but you can protect your reputation with your human interaction, your customer service, and all the things that you already talked about, that you've mentioned, the human element, the technology not being the answer. Uh,
yeah.
you know,
Well, it also comes down to the why, right? I mean, even I'm thinking back about like some of these manufacturers that are getting into window manufacturing. And, windows have been done forever. It's not like I mean, even in the innovation in the frame itself, at that point, it comes down to, well, you understood the material and you know that this is going to like improve the thermal performance or the thermal bridging for however that happens. So like it might be like a specific quirk in the design. So I think the moat sometimes, and that's usually the case with like, let's use Herman Miller chairs as an example. They're famously had a lot of their chairs copied, right? It's like you'll find, yeah, and I think that's a very good example to kind of attesting to, well, you'll always have the replication of it and to some degree, but the original might always be sought after because there's always a thing about the original being engineered a certain way because of a certain reason that will always come from the originating team. And so that can hardly be replicated. And so, yeah, to what extent those secrets can all be found out, even then, there's now, and there's always later too. Like just because it was for this one product, it's going to be for future products too. It's so it kind of goes into that realm for sure. You know?
This is really fascinating. We have a few more questions, but what how did you get to here? Like your career is kind of not like everyone normally sees or is linear from the construction
Oh,
industry, the AEC
yeah.
industry, but you've really found, I can tell you love our industry. And you're going to be doing something great in it for for the rest of your career probably. But how did you get to here?
You know, I asked myself, I over the years, I've started getting more of a practice of like reflecting. And I sometimes get to that point in time where like I'll reach a stage where I'm like, you know, why? And but it's more of an introspective journey. I think, um, so growing up, one of the experiences that I think, and this is more like doing a psychological analysis on myself. So when we moved to Romania, I had the kind of pleasure, and I'm kind of taking it for granted in some ways, but we grew up next to where we were building the house we were going to live in. And I remember those years very well because I saw everything, like from the foundation to the final finishes. And so I think something about that experience did ingrain somehow within me growing up. And just like being fascinated by the fact of like how everything happens and how everything comes together. So I think like going very early on, because I think those two have relations, right? To even how there's this like maybe traditional mindset of like parents were in the industry and then it kind of follows on like a tradition kind of thing. So I wouldn't say that I was ever uh condoned to like follow a career in AC in any way. That never happened. But I think over time, as I even learned more about software, I always had that itch about like that needs to be applied in some context and realm where like it adds real value. And so in the last 5 years, once I like got done studying software, I had this itch of like, well, what career is going to get me into a place that I can really understand where this software stuff can be applied in a way. And I just kept researching really. And the itch slowly came back, like from all the years in the past to the present, like this itch of like buildings or like this itch of physical spaces and like the spaces that we live in and we stay active in kind of kept itching back. So I didn't ignore it per se, but I kept looking at like, where is the world today in terms of that? Because a career in AEC can be very broad. Like it kind of fascinates me too sometimes for what a role in AEC can be, right? Like you can be in so many touch points for a firm depending on what they do. But it just comes down to like there being so many functions that enable better experiences. And so from that standpoint, I always kind of stuck through it to realize, okay, well, where are the true friction points? And that can be pretty endless. Like you'll find so many friction points easily.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think there's some relation of it in terms of that, and just the pursuit of life of wanting to do something that felt good, like from a adding value to society, the world, and the built environment does that very well. So I feel like it fits back in there. So some intentionality, but lots of mistakes along the way. I mean, really,
Well, that's how you
everything's a
know
happy accident.
that's how you know that it's real when that itch and that passion doesn't go away. Even it just keeps knocking on the door. You can ignore it all you want, but if it's a real thing, eventually you're
Yeah.
going to say yes to it. And we're glad that you said yes to it.
Yeah,
Well, I
So,
mean, go ahead.
sorry, I was gonna ask you,
Sure.
we've talked about so many really, really interesting things today. Is there anything that we haven't discussed today that we should have talked about, or is there anything that the industry should be talking about more but isn't?
Mm,
What's that fire, that fire that's driving you, that passion that's pushing you to make a difference?
well, there's one thing, and this is a bit biased now because I'm more recently. So one thing I found over the years too is that if I want to really get involved in any project or something that entails like uh something real going on, sticking closer to decision makers, developers seems to be the route, and just kind of observing what they're seeing is more of like higher priority. And so I live in Austin now, been here for the last 5 years. this place has also gone through its phases now in these last years for development, stuff like that. But one thing, so to see more the industry talk about, I think it's more to do with enabling more experiences for there to be more touch points within the industry. Even from like the AI companies today, they kept talking about, well, there is still a shortage of like trade specialists and like skilled trades in general, right? And for like the appetite for people to be interested in all these different facets of the industry, it feels like there's so many barriers or even just stigmas that are sometimes untrue for how they're connected. Um, but it kind of goes back to the idea that how can AEC be opened up to being more accessible to how the things connect together? And to give an example, so we're seeing a lot happening in fintech today that's relating to how capital is being deployed in operating properties. And like in that specific example, it's kind of interesting to realize that there are just so many annoyances that people have from their daily living and various environments that they're in, that it kind of calls for how the AC industry as a whole is more like the ambition is there to deliver on the projects, but the drive for those projects to happen comes from so many different points. And so I feel like there's always that potential to talk more about like what drives projects to happen that align more with society's needs that they actually care for to like solve whatever it might be coming to like communal living, right? Or like ways in which communities can engage with spaces that they can have access to. So I feel like that's something that is kind of interesting where how can you enable more of that, those feedback loops to integrate into this is a development category that will be both successful and calls for what people are actually, calling for. But I feel like we have this gap that comes from, oh, we're not sure how to communicate it from like the, desire side to we're not sure how we're communicating that we're trying to get in tune with what everyone wants. So I feel like that's where there could be more facilitation in terms of how can you drive more feedback loops into what developments are really called for that there will be engagement for so that, they're not wasteful projects in that sense.
Yeah, that's so important. And gosh, you've made so many excellent points. I can't wait to see the summary and to post all of this in the show notes because this is super gold. So thank you, Rami. This has been fantastic. So please tell us how can people follow what you're working on or get in touch with you.
Yeah, well, I'm on LinkedIn, so there's that. So Rami ISO, I'm there. Method and Build, that's the entity I've been working on for the last year or so. So there is that. That's also on LinkedIn. There's a website, methodandbuild.com. A lot of things in the works there. But that's one way to at least keep track. But yeah, I'm not a very big social media person, in that sense. So like, there's only so many following tags I can share, but those are the most available. And I'm always open to meeting folks. So for anyone also in Austin, I'm big on coffee chats and going out to networking stuff. So there's that. Yeah.
Yeah, I need to get
Great.
down there. I think you reached out to me on LinkedIn is how we first connected, which was great, and I'm really glad you did. After
Mhm.
that, we had a good conversation, the two of us, and then here on the
Yeah.
podcast today, we'll make sure that all of those things, your LinkedIn, your website, and those are put in the show notes so other people can continue this conversation. Maybe even you heard the invitation, everybody. Maybe even coffee in Austin. So, I
Yeah.
think I think that would be awesome to be able to do that in person. So. Yeah, so that's the pod. I'm glad you came on today. This podcast is made
Yeah.
available free to listeners thanks to support from Project Fluent and Advancing Prefabrication, which is the website is advancing dash prefabrication. That's just in a couple weeks. The discount code is Build Perspectives 10 for everyone to get a 10% discount, which is at the cost of events they are as they are these days. I think that's $150 to $200 discount, so that's pretty good. So today, if today's conversation resonates with you, you want more strategic and technical insights on prefab or building materials, building products, go to market, talk to reach out to us or Irami too, and get more information. And we'll make sure all of these things are in the show notes.
And if you love Build Perspectives, please again reach out on LinkedIn, text, comment, subscribe on whatever platform you listen on or watch. We're on YouTube now. Your ratings, reviews really help to bring new listeners to us and grow our audience, and they really help create content that's needed, helpful, relevant, and valuable. And I hope you loved today's podcast because I know I did.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad. I'm looking forward to more chats like this. So let us know what you think. This has hopefully been entertaining AEC talk and fresh perspectives. Something my dad says you can never have too much of. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Glad to be here.